Before you begin coring, ensure that all of your rods are lined up and marked so that you know where to begin the drive and how far to push the corer into the sediment. For the Bolivia coring device, there will only be one mark for both the start and stop position of the drive. Once you have the corer assembled, make sure that all the screws holding the tube in place are tightened down before you begin to collect the core. When you're ready to go, the core is lowered down into the hole through the casing. As you add the rods to the drill string, it's a good idea to count the rods so that you know how far into the sediment you are and when you get to the rod that has your mark on it.
Grab one. Grab one.
With a square rod system, you will need to hold the cable with the rods as you're lowering them down to keep the core from sliding down the square rod. You can unspool the cable fairly freely while making sure that you don't have any kinks in the cable.
Grab two. Grab two.
It is possible during winter coring that you can get some ice buildup between the rods that can keep the rods from threading on. If you do need to take a rod off, just make sure that you're holding tightly onto the lower rod to ensure that you do not unthread the drill string. Dipping the end of the rod into a little bit of lake-safe antifreeze can help free up any iced-up drive rod.
Grab three.
Once the corer gets into the sediment, it will stop free falling and it may take more of a push to get it back down to your starting point. Once the coring device is at the start mark, let go of the cable so it can be secured to the ice using the figure 8 and carabiner to maintain tension on the cable as you drive the corer into the sediment. The cable should be passed through the large hole of the figure 8 and then passed around the smaller loop, which can then be clipped back into the carabiner. The slack in the cable should then be pulled tight by pulling the tail parallel to the cable coming out of the corer. Once you've removed all the slack, you want to secure the cable. You can do this by wrapping excess cable around the large loop of the figure 8 and then threading it through the large loop. This will relieve the pressure on the person who's holding the cable so they don't have it tightening around their hand while the corer is being driven into the sediment. Once the piston cable is secured, the next step is to unlock the drive rods. This can be done by giving the rods a slight wiggle and pulling them up out of the hole. You will be moving them up the entire length of the square rod, so it should move out of the hole at a height of 1 meter. You will feel a clunk when it gets to the top, and then you will rotate it 90 degrees clockwise to lock the square rod in place. The square rod will lower down about 10 centimeters when it locks into place. Once you have it in position, you can drive the corer into the sediment. Remember that with the Bolivia coring system, the start mark that was on the side of the drive rods has moved up a meter during the unlocking of the square rod, and it is now the stop mark for core collection. Once you have driven the corer down to the stop mark, the cable should be released from the figure 8. As you pull the corer up, you'll want to be sure that you are holding onto the cable as well, so the piston can't slide down the hole. When the square rod was locked in place, around 10 centimeters of drive rod dropped back into the coring head. You will take this up again by raising the drive rods around 10 centimeters out of the hole before grabbing the cable to hold with the drive rods as you raise them out of the hole together. It's a good idea to have multiple people pulling out of the hole at the same time, being sure that when you pull out of the hole, you're lifting with your legs and not straining your back. As the drive rods and cable come out of the hole, it's a good idea to have someone managing the cable so it doesn't get tangled on the coring device or the people who are pulling it out. Make sure that as the corer is coming out of the hole, you're paying attention to how much of the drive rod string is up over your head. You don't want the rods to get too far above you as they will be difficult to unthread and the system becomes top-heavy, which could become dangerous. Note that as the coring device was lowered into the water, the hollow drive rods filled with water. So as you're unthreading the drive rods, be sure to lean them away from your colleagues so as not to soak them with cold lake water. As the rods come up, it's also a good idea to dip the ends in lake-safe antifreeze so they don't ice up and they're ready for the next drive. Once you can see the top of the square rod, you can remove the last drive rod on the drill string. Have an end cap ready for the bottom of the core tube. When you're pulling the corer out of the hole, it is best if you can do this in one quick movement. Once the cap is on, you can set the corer down on the ice. Use a rag to wipe any mud or water off the core tube so you can get the end cap on the bottom securely taped on. Note that the holes at the top of the plastic tube may continue to leak a bit of water. In cold temperatures, the electrical tape can become difficult to use, so you'll want to keep it in a pocket with a hand warmer. You will wrap the electrical tape around the joint between the core tube and the end cap. Once you're sure of a good contact with both the tube and the end cap, you'll lift up the corer a little so you can wrap the tape over the end of the cap to create a lip on the bottom to keep the cap from coming off. Once you have the bottom end cap securely in place, the next step is to cut around the piston to separate the coring device from the polycarbonate tube. For this, we use a plumbing pipe cutter. You will attach the pipe cutter around the lowermost metal ring on the piston that has the nose cone on it. You do not want to cut around the black rubber of the piston since this can damage it. If you cut below the piston, the tube will deform as you cut it, making it difficult to cut through. The pipe cutter gets adjusted by pushing in on the end. It can then be finely tightened by turning the knob on the end. Every rotation or two, you will want to tighten it by giving the knob a small turn. Once the cut is finished, you can release the pipe cutter by pressing the release button on the side. In this case, there was a little bit of water between the sediment and the piston, so we'll use a little bit of Zorbitrol to turn that water into a gel so the top of the core doesn't get disturbed. As you add the Zorbitrol, it's a good idea to tap the side of the core tube to allow it to settle in so you don't end up with a big clump of Zorbitrol at the top and water beneath. Be careful during high winds that you don't get the Zorbitrol in anyone's eyes. If there is still some space at the top, you can add a little bit of Zorbitrol and then a little bit of lake water to fill it up. You want to make sure that there's no gap that could allow the core to move inside the tube. Put the cap on by giving it a slight twist. Blue caps are used to indicate the top of the core, blue for the sky. There will be a little air bubble at the top that you can vent out with a screwdriver. You'll insert the screwdriver and put pressure on the top of the cap to push out the air so the cap sits properly on the core tube. Use a rag to wipe off any mud or Zorbitrol before securing the cap with electrical tape. Wrap the tape between the end cap and the tube and make sure to include a lip over the top of the cap to hold it on. Once you have both end caps secure, the next step is to write the label on the side of the core. Our standard naming scheme includes an expedition, site and hole code, a drive number, a tool code, which is B for Bolivia, and a section number. You'll want to write the label on both sides of the core so that when you split the core in half later, you have identification on both sides of the core tube. And in case of any smearing, you have a backup ID. There are arrows pre-drawn on the sides of the Bolivia core tube so that you know which way is up in addition to the blue cap on the core tube.